I thought I knew how old a file could be. January 1st, 1970. That's the beginning of Unix time, a date that lots of computers use as the reference date for measuring time. More on that later. Turns out, though, I was completely wrong. Every major desktop operating system today, Windows, macOS, and Linux, can all support files with dates older than January 1st, 1970. So how old can a file actually be? The short answer, surprise surprise, is that it depends. But what does it depend on? Mostly arbitrarily set dates, like the Unix epoch that I mentioned before. In other cases, it depends on how some guy in a silly hat decided the calendar should work in the year 1582. To make matters even more exciting, there's not even any sort of consistency between operating systems because, of course, there's not. This is also file system dependent, so I'll be specifying which exact file system I used for each of these tests. Let's start off with Windows, because it's still the most popular desktop operating system for now. On NTFS, the default file system for modern Windows, files use a file time, which represents the number of 100 nanosecond intervals since January 1st, 1601. File times use unsigned integers, meaning they can only have positive values, so the oldest time we can represent with these will be the time represented when the value is 0, so exactly January 1st, 1601. Why 1601? According to this blog post from Raymond Chen, who has worked on Windows for more than 30 years, 1601 was chosen because that was the first year of the cycle of the Gregorian calendar, which was active when Windows NT was under development. I'm staying far away from going down the whole calendar rabbit hole, but in short, the Gregorian calendar was created by Pope Gregory XIII, that guy with the funny hat I mentioned before, in 1582. A full cycle of the calendar where all the days line up exactly, including leap years, takes 400 years. Allowing file timestamps to go back to the start of the current Gregorian calendar cycle feels a bit arbitrary, but I guess it makes sense. The thing is, though, Pope Gregory XIII decreed the calendar into existence in 1582, not 1601. Different places adopted it at different times, so maybe that's why 1601 is the date here? But the British colonies in the Americas, now the United States, didn't adopt the calendar until 1750, when Britain did too, so I don't think that's it. I couldn't find anything online about what year actually technically serves as the start of a cycle. The New York Times in 1982 seemed to think that it was, in fact, 1582, because they wrote an article about how the first cycle had just ended. Maybe the Windows team fudged the date by 20 years or so, just because? 1601 is a bit of a strange date as a choice for the file system to start from, but we can at least sort of determine roughly where Windows got their inspiration for that date from, and all we really care about is the oldest date that we can use. So, January 1st, 1601 it is. Using PowerShell, I can set a file's last access time to that date and see that the file's timestamp is updated immediately. But wait a minute, why does File Explorer not show anything for last modified? That's kind of weird. I did some experimenting and it seems like the earliest time that File Explorer can be bothered to display is midnight on January 1st, 1980 in UTC time. I'm in PST, so this displays as 4 p.m. on December 31st, 1979. That's the earliest time that MS-DOS can represent, so maybe that's where the limitation comes from? That seems a little bit silly, but actually it appears that might be the case. I can't say for sure that this is right, but this answer on Stack Overflow from 10 years ago says it is, so that's basically guaranteed to be correct. But it could also be coming from a data type on Windows implementation of the SMB protocol, MSCIFS. It's kind of weird that the operating system supports earlier times than the file browser is willing to display, but whatever, I guess that's what you get on an OS that has decades of different layers of legacy code baked in. Next up is Linux, and no, I'm not going to look at every Linux distribution. Yeah, I know, you use Arch by the way, but I prefer the pumpkin spice latte flavor Linux Ubuntu. I'm running ext4 as my file system. It's time to talk about the Unix epoch. Back when computers were pretty new, they needed a way to know what the current time was. Enter Unix time, which works by declaring a reference date called the epoch, which is January 1st, 1970. By incrementing a counter every second since then, the computer can tell what time it is now. It just adds that many seconds to January 1st, 1970, and that's the current time. Ubuntu does use the Unix epoch to tell time, so it seems like its oldest representable date should be the epoch itself. But the amount of time since the Unix epoch is represented in Ubuntu as a 32-bit signed integer, meaning it can have either positive or negative values. This means that Ubuntu can represent times from before the Unix epoch. All it has to do is just save the timestamp as a negative value. The number of seconds here is 32 bits long, but 1 bit is used to indicate positive or negative, meaning the largest number it can actually fit is 2,147,483,647, and the smallest number is, yeah, I'm not saying all that again, it's just this. Subtracting that many seconds from January 1st, 1970 puts us at December 13th, 1901 at 8:45 UTC as the earliest possible time we can represent. We can set a file's access time to this date quite easily using the touch command, like this. And because Ubuntu is nice and good and cool, we can see this time accurately displayed in the file browser. Great, everything just works. Now let's look at macOS. Buckle up because this one is special. This video is sponsored by Scrimba. The holidays are nearly here, and if you want to learn a new coding language or how to code in the first place, you should try Scrimba. More than half of their courses are free, so you can check out the courses and platform, and if you like it, upgrade anytime to access all their content, exclusive Discord channels, and course certificates. Courses seamlessly combine video lessons with a code editor right in your browser, so you can pause the lesson and edit the code whenever you want. I think this is seriously cool. It's an engaging way to learn, and it means you don't have to deal with setting up your own environment locally. But if you want, you can also download the source files with a few clicks and develop on your own machine. Scrimba has courses in Python, JavaScript, React, AI, and more. And their front-end career path was developed in collaboration with MDN, the folks who make Firefox. So you'll be learning practical, in-depth, and modern web development skills. Right now, Scrimba is running a special JavaScript course for the holidays with some pretty sweet prizes, which you can check out at the link in the description. And if you decide you want to sign up for premium, you can get 20% off with that same link. Now back to making fun of macOS. Like Windows, macOS is fairly cobbled together and has a decent amount of legacy spaghetti code. It uses APFS, which somehow stands for Apple File System. The setFile command is one way of changing the date on a file, but weirdly it only allows us to go back to 1904. Anything beyond that and weird things start to happen. But setFile isn't the only way we have to change the date of a file in macOS. If you're willing to learn a bit of Swift, and I just barely was, you might come across this section of the developer docs that mentions distant past on the date class. Of course, it doesn't tell you the actual date that distant past represents, because I guess proper documentation wouldn't be anti-consumer enough for Apple. But fortunately, we can just print out what it is in the Swift REPL. Okay, it's December 30th in the year 1? Why? What's special about that date? Why not like January 1st, or even December 31st? That's weird, but whatever. I guess the point is just for it to be really long ago, so the exact date doesn't really matter. So let's learn the truly unfortunate amount of Swift required to set a file's timestamp to this date. Okay, I've finally done it. And the file only reports as being created on September 21st, 1677 from my Swift program. And if I read it with get file info, it tells me a date in 1949. Even worse, why does Finder show the time as 4:19 p.m. when Terminal shows midnight and 12 minutes? What kind of unnatural time zone conversion could possibly result in my local time zone being some hours and also 7 minutes off what the file system says? I feel like I'm taking crazy pills. So, as far as I can tell, the oldest date that the file system is willing to represent is September 21st, 1677. What's the significance of that number? I have absolutely no idea. Maybe Tim Apple just made it up. We've come this far, let's see if we can figure out where that date actually comes from. Okay, we're getting into extra credit here, but how far of a date in the future can we represent in macOS? Because the minimum date is just some random day in the past, I'm guessing that this is some signed data type. So if we get both the minimum date and the maximum date that mark the ends of the range, we can maybe find the number of seconds between the dates, then see if that's close to a power of 2 to take a guess at what the data type is they're using, and also find the reference date being used. So the furthest future date we can represent is April 11th, 2262. And there are this many days between then and November 20th, 1677. This is about 584 years. Divided by 2, that's 292. So to get the middle point of this range, we just subtract 292 from the max value. Any guesses? That's right, it's secretly been the Unix epoch all along, January 1st, 1970. The weird thing is that no powers of 2 near what 32 bits could represent fit this all that well. This is about 9 billion seconds, and if they were keeping track the same way as Linux, using 32 bits, we'd only have 2 billion seconds. So maybe it's a 64-bit signed integer? What's the max value there? Okay, I think this is it. It looks like Apple's keeping time by using a signed 64-bit integer to measure the nanoseconds since the Unix epoch. The number we get is so close, which also helps to explain why we see some milliseconds listed on the timestamps. That's not really that surprising, I guess, but what is surprising is all the other weird time stuff going on in macOS. They chose January 1st, 2001 as the reference date for their Swift standard library, and like we saw before, distant past is for some reason December 30th in the year 1. This is all apparently for maximum inconvenience. It's really all the Unix epoch happening under the hood. Alright, that was kind of a lot, but the too long didn't watch, I guess, is as far as how operating systems handle time, Linux makes the most sense and is the most consistent overall, followed by Windows, and macOS just can't seem to make its mind up at all. But why does it matter how old of a file we can represent? Mostly, it kind of doesn't, and that's probably why there's so much inconsistency. But the world did exist before 1970, even computers existed before then, so this might be a useful thing to be able to do. Probably most of the files you deal with day to day are much newer than 1970, but what if you have some old photographs or documents you want to digitize? It's conceivable that you might want to set the date for those image files to the date they were produced, instead of the day you digitize them, as an easy way to tell at a glance how old the original documents were. So, Windows can represent dates as far back as January 1st, 1601, but File Explorer only shows from January 1st, 1980 onwards, because MS-DOS, I guess? macOS claims that it can represent dates in the distant past, which apparently means December 30th in the year 1, but it can really only represent dates as far back as September 20th, 1677. Swift can show that date properly, but LS doesn't, and in Finder there's something super weird with the time zones going on. And as always, Linux is perfect and can do no wrong, supporting timestamps back to December 13th, 1901 in the terminal and file browser with no issues. Overall, everything's made up and time is meaningless. Tom Scott was right. Just let someone else do all this for you and hope they get it right, because you sure as heck won't.